Steam locomotives bring out the best in people. The pride in the job, the pride in the company. This is the city of Truro, built in 1903 at Swindon Railway Factory for the Great Western Railway. The first locomotive to break the 100-mile-an-hour barrier, capable of running from Paddington to Plymouth non-stop at 70 miles an hour. This engine was to set the standard for the next 50 years. It was built here at Swindon Railway Factory, the centre of top-quality locomotive and carriage construction for the GWR. There, that's years since I've moved a signal lever, and I'm doing it in a museum. Years ago, I was a mainline signalman at Challow, just down the line from here, a few miles, and that was the age of steam. And the locomotives that used to go by, the engines that made the job worth doing, were made at Swindon Railway Factory, a few miles on beyond my box at Challow. And I'm going to take you back now on a nostalgic trip, and we're going to have a look at the comradeship and the craftsmanship and the skill and the sweat that went into making those locomotives that we loved so much. Swindon Works was an engineering hellhole. It was dark and gloomy, it was hot, swimming in oil, it was dangerous. The men had to handle molten metal, they were swinging great ingots of white hot metal onto the anvils of their steam hammers. The men in the foundry handling ladles full of molten metal and pouring it like so much tea or milk into cups, except that they were pouring it into a casting. In the forges there were long lines of steam hammers, big steam hammers, the Naismiths, the really big 7-tonners, forging coupling rods and connecting rods. The skill of working with maybe just a little hup or a hit, and all 5 or 6 men of the team holding this red-hot ingot in their tongs, sliding it across the anvil as the hammer beat up and down, until they had beaten that into shape. Boiler making. Imagine an iron tube, 10 feet, 15 feet long. The outside rivet man holds the former over the end of the rivet, and the man inside must beat it flat, thundering on an iron tube which he's standing inside, the whole noise focused on his head. There were milling machines, 500-ton boilerplate presses, all these gigantic Vulcan-like machines to force the great lumps of metal into the shape of these lovely steam engines which gave the railway its glamour. The Great Western Railway was a creation of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a great Victorian genius, a great civil engineer, a man who wanted a new kind of railway, an express railway. And to do this, he set the rails much wider apart than had been the case before. He had a 7-foot gauge. The problem with Brunel was he was no locomotive engineer, and he threw away all the advantage of the broad gauge in rotten engines that didn't work. And the day was saved by Brunel employing Daniel Gooch at the age of 21 to be the locomotive engineer of the Great Western Railway. Gooch decided on Swindon as the site for his railway factory for precise engineering reasons. Swindon was the summit of the railway. It was fairly level out from London to Swindon, but from Swindon to Bristol, the line descended 2 steep gradients, one at Dauncey and one at Box. To negotiate these much steeper hills, they had to have engines with smaller wheels, so these could be changed at Swindon.
Of the early locomotives, of course, North Star is always mentioned, although, of course, it was not built at Swindon. But it was the first locomotive to pull a official train, the director's special, when the railway was open. Of more importance is the locomotive Great Western, built in 1846, the first locomotive made here at Swindon. It was ordered, designed and built in 13 weeks and performed magnificently.
Now, technically, the broad gauge was a very good idea. Unfortunately, it was 10 years too late. George Stephenson had already set the standard, the coal cart gauge, the ordinary 4 foot 8.5 inches, which we still use to this day. Because Brunel was late on the scene, his broad gauge was isolated, and where it met other railways, you had the appalling problem of transferring everything from out of broad gauge wagons into narrow gauge wagons, or vice versa, and there would be this terrible scene at a place like Gloucester with all the people trooping across the platforms carrying parrots in cages and screaming children, and there were the dogs. Boxes of eggs had to be shipped, and was a jolly big nuisance. With the final change of gauge in 1892, much bigger engines were needed, and the Great Western Railway was very lucky in having exactly the right man at the right time in the form of George Jackson Churchward to build them much more powerful, much more modern locomotives.
The Swindon engines were very good engines. They were living pieces of machinery, and we enjoyed working with them. They were hard work, definitely hard work, because they had a large appetite for coal, and the firemen had to work very hard, especially upon the express passengers.
Brunel hopelessly underestimated the cost of building the railway. So by the time it came to build the factory and the village to house the workers and the station with its hotel, there was no money in the kitty. So the directors struck a bargain with Rigby, the contractor for building railway stations. He would build the cottages and the station at his own expense, and in return for that, he would have the rents from the cottages, which the workmen would pay, and he would have the proceeds of the refreshment room. And the Great Western promised to stop every train for 10 minutes at the station so that the captive passengers could go and eat stale pork pies and drink bad coffee. That left the company with enough money to build the works. Swindon prided itself on the fineness of the fitting of the locomotives in the erecting shop. When it was put together into the final machine, they were a sliding perfect fit. The work that these men turned out was of the highest quality.
Tremendously high. Standards were tremendously high. In fact, I've seen chaps virtually in tears, you know, because they'd taken, shall we say, a grain too much off of a bearing, something like 10 thousandths of an inch too much. Although we were still within tolerance, it wasn't perfect, you know, that sort of standard.
Swindon Works was self-sufficient. There was practically nothing that they didn't make for the company in the factory. During the war, they were very proud to be able to say to the Royal Arsenals, yes, we'll rifle gun barrels for you, of course we will. There was nothing that Swindon couldn't turn its hand to, providing it was high-precision engineering.
We must not overlook, of course, the fact that this was a locomotive carriage and wagon works, two completely separate organizations on the same site with separate management. The carriage works was built first in 1868 and produced virtually all the rolling stock for the Great Western Railway over about 100 years, and some very fine vehicles came out of the works over that period. The particular artists, if one can use that word, were the carriage finishers who did all the interior work, and the carriage trimmers, who you would understand as upholsterers, who did absolutely magnificent work. In 1883, the then locomotive superintendent, William Dean, introduced a class of 060 goods locomotives, which have been since known as the Dean Goods. They were a sturdy, comparatively small, but very tough and efficient locomotive for the period. About 280 were built. Of equal interest were the small prairie tanks, as we call them, built for branch line work by Churchward. These were delightful little locomotives, and a very large number of them were built, I believe about 165, and they transformed branch line services throughout the whole service of steam on the Great Western Railway.
And this was quite a nice engine to drive, a very free-running engine indeed. The only thing that you could grumble about these was the limited space on the actual footplate itself. Shoveling the coal from the bunker into the firebox. We used to try and get special shovels with the ends cut off so that we didn't hit our hands and our knuckles on the side of the footplate itself. But all in all, they were quite good to work upon. The firemen had to keep filling the tank with water because they held around about 1,300 gallons of water, and that was soon used up.
This early class of star locomotives was the embodiment of all the experimentation and trials which George Jackson Churchward had made over nearly 10 years. And it proved to be a turning point in the design of steam locomotives, not only in this country, but in the world. The boiler was used right throughout the Great Western steam history. In 1924, a new mixed traffic locomotive was required. An existing locomotive was modified and tested successfully, and the first order for this new design was for 80 engines. This was the Hall class, named initially after famous houses in the Great Western area. They proved so useful that building continued into BR days. The last appeared in October 1950, when 330 of these universal workhorses were in service.
The heyday of Swindon Railway Factory began in 1903, when George Jackson Churchward's new, powerful, standard locomotives began to come out of the works. The Great Western locomotive fleet had to be re-equipped, and by 1921, 14,000 men were employed in the works. This engine, one of the Castle class, is the epitome of Great Western greatness. Between 1923 and 1950, Swindon Factory produced 168 of these. They were the Great Western Express passenger engine, and they hauled thousands between Paddington, Shrewsbury and Penzance.
The Castle-class locomotives were very reliable and economical. They worked the principal services over the whole system. The famous King class followed the Castles in 1927. The most powerful steam passenger type in the country, these 30 locomotives were designed to haul the heaviest express trains on the Paddington to Plymouth and the Paddington to Wolverhampton routes. One of the successes of the BR standard range was the large 210 freight locomotive. It was soon found to be capable of excellent running at high speeds and then used extensively for passenger duties. Number 92220, outshot from Swindon in 1960, was the last steam locomotive to be built there and the very last built for BR. Appropriately named Evening Star, it was finished in true Great Western style.
The Great Western had a wonderful corporate image, to use a modern phrase. They had their copper cap chimney, which went right back to the beginnings of the railway. They were very, very concerned about tradition, and the men attached their loyalty to the copper cap, to the brass safety valve cover, to the cream and brown coaches. Went right back to the beginnings of the railway. And the beautiful nameplates, the typeface which was used in those nameplates was the same in 1950 as it had been in 1837. In some cases, 5 generations of Swindonians had built those locomotives. Doubtless outsiders would say that Swindon people were arrogant, but that was because they weren't inside and they were not part of this wonderful legend which was Swindon Factory.
The shop in which we're in, the A shop, was probably the biggest workshop in Western Europe at the time it was built. And housed in there were thrust together day after day. And going back to my father's day, they were starting at 6 o'clock in the morning and not finished until 6 in the evening. But they still found time for the tremendous social activities. And it was all up around the old Great Western Railway.
Everyone seemed to know everybody else, and the activities were much more sort of closely knit. Life was slower. We had no distractions like television or radio, and we made our own music. And every year we put on a concert, and we had socials, which were very good. But life was hard, very hard. And yet they all managed to find time for certain things. Trip, well, they all found time for that and look forward all the year to it. Every year in July, on the first Friday of July, that was Trip Day. And the railway company would rent lots of special trains for their employees to get away. And in the first place, it was usually just for a day. And then later on it became possible for people to go away for a week. The trains would go mostly to Weston and Weymouth because it was possible to do that in a day. They expected that 26,000 people would go, and the company put on 32 trains with 360 carriages. The wonderful thing about it was, you see, that we were all going together. That the railway company wasn't altogether benevolent because they didn't pay the men for their holiday.
The Great Western Railway was very paternal. It provided a church, a medical service. It provided the Mechanics Institute building where you could go to hear your lectures, to take your tuition.
They catered for everything, from the cradle to the grave. They even had their own hearse for you at the end of the day. And education was quite a priority. It was no good having a workforce that were illiterate. And when the railway started, you see, back in about 1842, people were illiterate. And so, of course, they had to educate them. They started the school, you see, down in this railway village.
This town was a total railway community right up to the 1950s. But it is often overlooked that all the welfare here was really the effect of the people themselves. The Mechanics Institution was started by about 15 tradesmen who got together a library of about 115 books in 1843 for their self-help. And the year following, the Mechanics Institution was formed, with the aid and assistance, obviously, of the managerial staff here, because it was to their advantage to weld together this community placed out in a green field. Yes, they borrowed money from the Great Western Railway, who were very pleased to loan them money on a certain rate of interest, I may say, but the whole organisation was always run by the staff.
The medical fund again was very, very wonderful. We used to pay just a small few pence a week, and that would entitle us to the choice of 7 doctors or specialists or hospital treatment. And they had barbers there, they had washing baths, swimming baths, they had 3 dentists there. Wonderful.
Trade unions were never recognised by the GWR. When the First World War broke out, the government took over the running of all railways and recognised the existence of trade unions, so that when the railways were handed back to the companies in 1921, the union was already there, and the company then had a fait accompli.
The Great Western were always looked upon as reasonable employers. There was a hierarchy, and they all looked after one another all down through the different levels. Particularly at Swindon, which was very much a community, even more possibly than the rest of the railway. The people had generally grown up together and lived together, and everybody knew their place, as we would have said in those days, but everybody respected one another, whatever job they were doing.
Very strict, yes. Disciplinarians, particularly in the early days when I go back to 1922 to 1930. Yes, you respected anybody who was a grade above you. And you stood to attention when at the boss's desk. You called everybody sir, you called the ladies ma'am. And it did me a lot of good, this discipline.
The men were servants, and provided they kept their nose clean, they'd be okay. However well you did, if they didn't want you anymore, you got laid off. I have known of men who, having been laid off, went away to the Gloucester Aircraft Corporation or the Bristol Aircraft Factory. But when the factory said, "Would you come back, we need you," those men were straight back to inside, because there was nothing like working inside. The men loved working for the Great Western Railway.
It seemed to be quite an alteration when nationalisation came about. I don't know why, but we always felt it wasn't quite the same family. And for quite a number of years, there seemed to be a deterioration in the feeling inside. Morale went down.
Swindon Works is a ghost of its former self. Workshop skills in forge and foundry are not needed as Swindon adapts to a future based on service industries. It looks as if the workshop pride of the factory will become just another of the legends of the past.
The
on a Maharaja's train and a steam into history.